A new police chief walks into his precinct undercover, hoping to observe his officers without their masks on. But when a white cop spits in his face, thinking he's just a nobody, the entire room is moments away from a shocking revelation that will leave them all reeling. The journey before Blue Ridge. Richard Nelson hadn't always dreamed of being a police chief. As a young boy growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, he had watched his neighborhood with careful eyes, noting the tension that crackled between the police and the people they were supposed to protect. His father, Marcus Nelson, worked double shifts at a factory, while his mother, Dorothy, cleaned houses to make ends meet. They taught him two things above all else: dignity and perseverance. "Son," his father would say, wiping the sweat from his brow after a 14-hour shift, "respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn, but it's also something you give freely to every human being, no matter who they are." Richard was 12 when he witnessed an incident that would shape the rest of his life. He was walking home from school when he saw two police officers roughly handling Mr. Johnson, the elderly man who ran the corner store. Mr. Johnson had done nothing wrong. Someone had simply reported a suspicious person in the area. Richard watched as the old man tried to explain, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and indignation, while the officers dismissed his words without a second thought. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. The image of Mr. Johnson's face, filled with hurt and humiliation, haunted him. At breakfast, the next morning, he asked his mother a question that had been burning in his mind. "Mama, why do some police officers treat people like they don't matter?" Dorothy set down her coffee cup and looked at her son with eyes that held both sadness and wisdom. "Baby, some people forget that the badge is a responsibility, not a privilege. They forget that power without compassion is just tyranny in uniform." "Then I want to be different," Richard declared with the fierce certainty of youth. "I want to be a police officer who remembers." His parents exchanged glances, a mixture of pride and worry crossing their faces. They knew the road ahead would be difficult for their son, a young black man entering a profession where he would constantly have to prove himself, where he would face prejudice not just from the outside, but sometimes from within the ranks. Building the foundation, Richard graduated high school with honors and enrolled in the criminal justice program at Georgia State University. He worked part-time jobs to help with tuition, refusing to let his parents shoulder the entire burden. During his college years, he volunteered at community centers, teaching conflict resolution to teenagers and working with youth outreach programs. His professors noticed something special about him. Unlike many students who were drawn to law enforcement for the authority it provided, Richard was genuinely interested in justice, in the philosophical and practical aspects of what it meant to serve and protect. He wrote papers on community policing, on the psychology of bias, on the historical relationship between minority communities and law enforcement. Mr. Nelson, his professor, Dr. Patricia Williams, said after class one day, "You have a gift. You see beyond the surface. But I want to warn you, the real world of policing can be harsh. It can wear down even the most idealistic among us. Promise me you won't lose sight of why you're doing this." "I promise," Richard replied, and he meant it. After graduation, Richard entered the police academy. The training was grueling, both physically and mentally, but he excelled. He was often the only black recruit in his classes, and he felt the weight of representation on his shoulders. Some instructors treated him fairly. Others seemed to scrutinize his every move, looking for reasons to fail him. He persevered, refusing to give them any ammunition. During a training exercise on de-escalation, Richard demonstrated a technique that involved listening and building rapport rather than immediately asserting dominance. His instructor, a gruff veteran named Sergeant Peterson, watched with narrowed eyes. "Nelson," Peterson called out, "in the real world, criminals don't want to chat. They want to hurt you." "With respect, sir," Richard replied, keeping his voice level. "In the real world, most situations don't require force. They require understanding. If we approach every interaction assuming the worst, we create the very conflicts we're trying to prevent." The room went silent. Some recruits nodded in agreement. Others rolled their eyes. Peterson studied Richard for a long moment before saying, "You've got ideals, Nelson. Let's see if they survive your first year on the streets. The early years on the force, Richard's first assignment was in a precinct in East Atlanta, a neighborhood struggling with poverty, crime, and a deep mistrust of the police. His field training officer, a weary veteran named Officer Mike Brennan, gave him the lay of the land on their first day together. "Listen, kid," Brennan said as they drove through the streets. "I know you're fresh out of the academy with all those fancy ideas about community policing, but out here you need to be tough. These people respect strength, not kindness." Richard listened but didn't agree. Over the following months, he began to build his own approach. When responding to calls, he took the time to talk to people, to understand their situations. He learned names, remembered faces, and followed up on cases even when it wasn't required. There was Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman whose home had been broken into 3 times. Other officers had filed the reports mechanically, but Richard visited her regularly, helped her install better locks, and coordinated with neighborhood watch groups to keep an eye on her street. When they finally caught the perpetrators, Mrs. Patterson hugged Richard with tears in her eyes. "You're different," she said. "You actually care." Not all his colleagues appreciated his methods. Some mocked him, calling him Social Worker Nelson or suggesting he was too soft for real police work. But Richard noticed something. The complaints against him were 0, while several of his peers had multiple complaints filed against them for excessive force or disrespectful conduct. One night, Richard and his partner responded to a domestic disturbance call. When they arrived, they found a young couple in the midst of a heated argument. The man, visibly intoxicated, became belligerent when he saw the police. Richard's partner immediately reached for his baton, but Richard stepped forward, his hands open and non-threatening. "Hey, I'm Richard," he said calmly. "I can see you're upset. Let's talk about what's going on." It took 20 minutes, but Richard managed to defuse the situation without any use of force. The man agreed to sleep at his brother's house for the night, and the woman thanked them for not making things worse. As they walked back to the patrol car, Richard's partner shook his head. "I don't know how you do it, man. You've got patience I'll never have," Richard smiled. "It's not about patience. It's about remembering that everyone we encounter is somebody's son, somebody's father, somebody's brother. They're human beings first, suspects second." Rising through the ranks over the years, Richard's reputation grew. He solved cases not just through investigation, but through building trust within the community. People who wouldn't normally talk to the police would share information with him because they knew he would listen and act with integrity. He was promoted to detective, then to sergeant. With each promotion came new challenges and new resistance. Some of his superiors were supportive. Others resented his methods and his success. There were times when Richard felt the weight of being a trailblazer, of constantly having to prove that compassion and effectiveness weren't mutually exclusive. During his time as a sergeant, Richard mentored younger officers, trying to instill in them the values his parents had taught him. He held informal training sessions on implicit bias, on cultural competency, on the importance of seeing the humanity in everyone they encountered. "This job will test you," he told a group of rookies one evening. "You'll see terrible things. You'll deal with people on their worst days. But you have a choice every single time. You can add to the pain in the world, or you can try to heal it. The badge gives you power, but it's how you use that power that defines who you are." One of those rookies, a young woman named Sarah Martinez, would later say that Richard's words changed the trajectory of her career. "He made me understand that being a good cop isn't about how many arrests you make or how tough you are. It's about how many lives you touch positively." Richard was promoted to lieutenant, then to captain. With each step up the ladder, he gained more influence but also faced more entrenched resistance. He pushed for policy changes, for better training, for accountability measures. Some of his initiatives were adopted. Others were quietly shelved by administrators who preferred the status quo. The call to Blue Ridge, after 20 years in law enforcement, Richard had built a reputation as a reformer and a leader. When the position of police chief opened up in Blue Ridge, North Carolina, the city council was looking for someone who could address growing concerns about police misconduct and community relations. Richard's name came up repeatedly. The city manager, Eleanor Chen, called him personally. Chief Caldwell is retiring, and frankly, we need someone who can clean house. We've had too many complaints, too many incidents swept under the rug. Your record speaks for itself, Chief Nelson. Would you consider joining us? Richard visited Blue Ridge for an interview and immediately sensed the challenges ahead. The precinct had an old boys club atmosphere, and the few officers of color he saw seemed isolated and marginalized. During a community meeting, residents expressed frustration and distrust, citing numerous instances of disrespectful treatment and excessive force. That night, sitting in his hotel room, Richard called his wife, Angela. They had been married for 15 years, and she knew him better than anyone. "It's going to be difficult, isn't it?" she asked. "Yes," Richard admitted. "But Angela, these are the situations where I can make the biggest difference. This department needs someone who isn't afraid to shake things up." "Then you already know what you're going to do," Angela said with a gentle laugh. "Just promise me you'll be careful. Change threatens people, and threatened people can be dangerous." "I promise," Richard said. He accepted the position, and they announced his appointment with minimal fanfare. Richard specifically requested that his official introduction be delayed by a week, claiming he needed time to relocate. In truth, he wanted to see the department as it really was, unfiltered and unprepared. The day before, the evening before his undercover visit, Richard sat in his new home in Blue Ridge, reviewing files on the precinct. Captain Harris had sent him personnel records, incident reports, and community complaints. The patterns were troubling. Repeated allegations against certain officers, complaints that went uninvestigated, a culture that seemed to protect its own regardless of misconduct. One name appeared frequently: Officer Brandon Daniels. Multiple complaints for use of excessive force, disrespectful treatment of civilians, and inappropriate comments. Yet he remained on the force without any significant disciplinary action. Angela found him at midnight, still poring over the documents. "Come to bed, Richard. You can't solve everything in one night." "I know," he said, rubbing his tired eyes. "But tomorrow is important. I need to see what I'm really walking into." "Just remember," Angela said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You can't change everyone. Some people are too invested in the way things are." "Maybe not," Richard agreed, "but I have to try." That night, Richard barely slept. He thought about his parents, about the lessons they had taught him, about Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Patterson and all the people whose faces he carried with him. He thought about the oath he had taken 20 years ago to serve and protect, to uphold justice and dignity. When his alarm went off at dawn, Richard was ready. He dressed in simple clothes, the kind an ordinary person would wear, and looked at himself in the mirror. He saw not a police chief, but simply a man, and that was exactly the point. He wanted his officers to reveal who they were when they thought no one important was watching. As he drove toward the precinct in the early morning light, Richard felt a mixture of anticipation and determination. He knew that what he was about to do was risky, that it might generate resistance and controversy, but he also knew it was necessary. "This is for everyone who's been disrespected," he said quietly to himself. "For everyone who's been treated as less than human. This is where change begins." He parked his car in the precinct's parking lot, adjusted his baseball cap, and took a deep breath. The weight of his mission pressed heavy on his shoulders, but he walked forward with purpose, ready to see the truth, and prepared to do whatever it took to make things right. It was a muggy Tuesday morning in August, and Richard Nelson, newly appointed police chief of Blue Ridge, was about to walk into his precinct undercover, hoping to observe his officers without their masks on. 3 years later. The legacy. 3 years had passed since that pivotal Tuesday morning when Richard Nelson walked into the Blue Ridge precinct in plain clothes. The department had transformed in ways that once seemed impossible. The walls that once echoed with insensitive jokes and casual prejudice now hummed with a different energy, one of professionalism and mutual respect. Richard stood in his office on a quiet Friday evening, looking at a framed photograph on his desk. It showed him surrounded by a diverse group of new recruits, their faces bright with hope and determination. Among them was Marcus Thompson, a young black officer who had told Richard during his interview that he joined the force because he had heard about a chief who actually cared about doing things right. "You inspired me, sir," Marcus had said, his voice thick with emotion. "You showed me that it's possible to be both a good cop and a good person." Richard kept that photograph as a reminder of why the hard days were worth it, why every difficult conversation and every moment of resistance had meaning. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. After Daniels' suspension became permanent and he was eventually dismissed from the force, several other officers had resigned rather than adapt to the new standards. Richard had faced pushback from the police union, from some city council members who feared he was being too aggressive, and from officers who resented being held accountable for their actions. There were nights when he came home exhausted, when Angela would find him sitting in silence, carrying the weight of it all. "Am I doing the right thing?" He had asked her one particularly difficult evening after a veteran officer accused him of betraying his own people by being too hard on the department. Angela had taken his face in her hands and looked him straight in the eyes. "Richard Nelson, you have never betrayed anyone except those who deserved to be betrayed. You're fighting for something bigger than yourself, bigger than this department. You're fighting for the kind of world we want our children to grow up in." Her words had given him strength to continue, to push through the resistance and stay true to his vision. But the victories, when they came, were profound. The community's relationship with the police had begun to heal in tangible ways. Crime reports were up not because crime had increased, but because people finally trusted the police enough to report incidents. Officer Reyes, who had once admitted to being complicit in the toxic culture out of fear, was now training new recruits in community engagement and had received multiple commendations from residents. The precinct had implemented regular town halls where community members could voice concerns directly to officers, and Richard made it a point to attend every single one. During one such meeting, an elderly black man named Mr. James Wilson stood up, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm 73 years old," he said, "and for most of my life I was afraid of the police. But I want to thank Chief Nelson and his officers for showing me that things can be different. Last month, when my home was broken into, Officer Chen not only caught the person responsible, but also checked on me every day for 2 weeks to make sure I felt safe. That's the kind of policing we need." The room had erupted in applause, and Richard had felt tears prick his eyes. These were the moments that mattered, the small victories that added up to real change. As he locked his office and walked through the precinct that evening, Richard exchanged greetings with officers finishing their shifts. The laughter he heard was genuine, the camaraderie built on respect rather than shared prejudice. He thought about that young boy from the community event 3 years ago, the one who had said his father didn't trust the police. Richard had seen him recently, and the boy had waved enthusiastically, running over to show Richard his good report card. Change was never easy, Richard reflected as he drove home through the streets of Blue Ridge, but it was always, always worth the fight. The seeds of change. Before Blue Ridge, Richard Nelson's journey to becoming a transformative police chief began long before he ever set foot in Blue Ridge, North Carolina. It started in the cramped but loving 2-bedroom apartment in Atlanta where he grew up, the youngest of 3 children. His older sister Monica was a teacher, and his brother James worked as a social worker. The Nelson family was built on a foundation of service to others, a value instilled by their parents who believed that true success was measured not by what you accumulated, but by how many lives you touched. Richard's childhood was filled with Sunday dinners where his father would share stories from the factory floor. Tales of injustice and dignity, of workers who stood up for each other despite differences in race or background. "The world tries to divide us, son," Marcus would say, his weathered hands clasped together on the table. "It wants us to see each other as enemies. But the truth is we all want the same things: respect, safety, and a chance to provide for our families." These dinner table lessons became the bedrock of Richard's philosophy, shaping his understanding that true leadership meant bridging divides rather than exploiting them. The incident with Mr. Johnson wasn't the only formative experience of Richard's youth. When he was 15, his brother James was stopped by police while walking home from his social work night classes. Despite carrying his work identification and explaining his purpose, James was handcuffed and held for 2 hours while officers searched for outstanding warrants that didn't exist. When James finally came home that night, Richard saw something in his brother's eyes he had never seen before, a mixture of rage and helplessness that shook him to his core. "I did everything right," James said, his voice breaking. "I was respectful, I complied with every order. I showed them my ID, but none of it mattered, because they had already decided who I was the moment they saw me." Their mother held James while he cried, and their father sat in silence, his jaw clenched with an anger born from decades of similar experiences. That night, Richard made a vow to himself. If he became a police officer, he would never make anyone feel the way his brother felt that night. He would never strip someone of their dignity, never treat them as guilty until proven innocent, never forget that behind every face was a human being with a story, a family, and dreams just like his own. Richard's path through the police academy was marked by both triumph and tribulation. He excelled in his coursework and physical training, but he also faced subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination from some instructors and fellow recruits. There was the time when an instructor assigned him to play the role of a criminal in a training scenario for 3 consecutive weeks, while white recruits rotated through various roles. There was the day when he overheard 2 recruits joking about how diversity hires were lowering the standards of the academy. Each incident was a small cut, but Richard refused to let them define him or deter him. Instead, he used them as fuel, pushing himself to be beyond reproach in every aspect of his training. He graduated at the top of his class, earning the respect even of those who had initially doubted him. During his graduation ceremony, Dr. Williams, his former college professor who had come to watch him receive his badge, pulled him aside. "Richard, you're about to enter a profession that desperately needs people like you, but it's also a profession that may try to change you," she warned. "You'll see things that will make you angry, frustrated, and disillusioned. You'll be tempted to become cynical, to adopt the very attitudes you're hoping to change. Promise me you'll hold on to your ideals even when it's difficult," Richard promised, not knowing then just how often he would need to remember those words in the years to come. The early years of Richard's career were a crucible that tested everything he believed in. His first year on the force was particularly challenging as he navigated the complex dynamics of the precinct while trying to maintain his principles. He watched officers use excessive force during routine stops and then justify it in their reports with exaggerated claims of threat. He witnessed colleagues plant evidence or coach each other on how to write reports that would justify questionable actions. When he privately expressed concerns to his field training officer, Brennan sighed heavily. "Look, Nelson, I get it. You want to be one of the good guys. But you need to understand something. This job changes you. You see the worst of humanity every single day, and if you don't build up some armor, it'll destroy you. Sometimes that means cutting corners, sometimes it means looking the other way, and sometimes it means backing up your fellow officers even when you're not sure they were right." Richard understood what Brennan was saying, but he couldn't accept it. He had seen firsthand how that mentality corroded communities and destroyed trust. So he chose a different path, one that was lonelier and more difficult, but aligned with who he was. He built relationships in the community, not through force or intimidation, but through consistency and genuine care. When other officers mocked him for spending extra time talking to residents or following up on cases after his shift ended, Richard simply smiled and continued. He knew that real change happened not through grand gestures, but through small, consistent actions repeated over time. And slowly, impossibly slowly, he began to see results. Crime in his patrol area decreased not because of aggressive enforcement, but because community members trusted him enough to report suspicious activity and work with him to address problems before they escalated. It was the beginning of a philosophy that would define his entire career. Policing wasn't about power over communities. It was about power with communities, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared goals for safety and justice.